BIOL 100, Chapter 33, the Animal Body Plan, Basic Form and Function. Talking about animal body plans, there's three key aspects that are discussed in this chapter. First, we're going to go over symmetry and different body plans. Second, we'll go into bioenergetics and thermal regulations, and then we'll wrap it all up with tissues. In this lecture, it is not as detailed as your book, as many lectures are, but please make sure you go through your book and kind of read up on some of the details and some of these like specific tissues or maybe different parts of thermal regulation, as you could see some of those on your quiz. We've got basically three different types of body plans. So we start off with our asymmetrical, and that's kind of like our earliest ancestors, right? That's when we're pretty far back in our evolutionary tree, and we're going with asymmetrical body plans. So these are things like sponges, but all other animals moving further on the tree do have symmetry. They're referred to often as eumetozoa, and their symmetry is defined along an imaginary axis drawn through the animal's body, and it depends on what type of symmetry what type of symmetry they fall into. It's either radial or bilateral. So radial symmetry has body parts arranged around a central axis, and it can be bisected into two equal halves in a 2D plane. So these are things like anemones, some corals, sea stars, things like that. Whereas bilateral symmetry is probably what you think of when you think of most animals, humans included. We have right and left halves that are mirror images, and only the sagittal plane will bisect the animal into two equal halves. And then, of course, we have our asymmetrical animals here, like our sponges. So talking now about body shapes, sizes, and metabolism, we'll go a little bit further into metabolism as well, but small unicellular organisms, they get their nutrients through diffusion. Okay, so they're actively diffusing nutrients into their body, and they're not necessarily taking in nutrients by eating or sometimes even by photosynthesizing. So we know that our cell size is constrained by surface area to volume ratio. So basically we want to have a good ratio of surface area to volume. And as your cell gets larger, that ratio decreases, which isn't good, right? So what we do as you get larger, you don't just get larger cells, you actually have more cells and you become multicellular. So our unicellular organisms are the ones that are smaller, less complex, and they're the ones who don't have to actively eat different things to get in nutrients. It's usually just through some simple process like diffusion. Whereas our larger organisms now are becoming multicellular, and they have to get all their nutrients and oxygen to all cells that are in their body, including specialized cells, organs, and organ systems. Remember, we started off with how the body is organized, going from, well, really starting from atoms, but then going into eventually cells, and then tissues, organs, organ systems, and then the whole body. So again, kind of starting with sponges, these are our simplest animals. They lack defined tissues and organs. They fall into a category called parazoa, and they have the ability to disaggregate and aggregate their cells, but they are very simple animals, usually making up very few cells within the body, whereas our eumetozoa or other animals have distinct and well-defined tissues. So they've got many more cells. It doesn't mean that these guys are unicellular. They are still multicellular. But eumetozoa is more complex. They have symmetry. Parazoa does not. And eumetozoa also has irreversible differentiation for most cell types, which means that we have things or cells for certain organs or tissues, like we have kidney cells, or we have cells that have differentiated and have a purpose, whereas these guys have more simple cells that can kind of do different things within the body. So getting into bioenergetics now, which is how animals use and obtain energy. we kind of differentiate this between endotherms and ectotherms as well. So keep that in mind. An endotherm is a warm-blooded animal, so that's like us humans, and many other animals that you would commonly think of whose environment is regulated by internal processes, whereas an ectotherm, which would be like decapods or ectotherms, a lot of other bugs as well. And these guys depend on their environment to regulate their internal environment. So we call them cold-blooded, right? So if the environment is cold outside, then they're going to be cold. They have no internal processes to regulate their internal temperature, whereas endotherms do. And when we're talking about how animals are getting nutrients, we have two different kinds of how we can differentiate, right? We have autotrophs, which are, it's not necessarily just animals, but autotrophs usually tend to be plants. These are organisms that can obtain energy from the sun. They're photosynthesizers. And then we have heterotrophs who get their energy from eating other autotrophs or possibly other heterotrophs. So they're getting their energy from eating other organisms, not from photosynthesizing. And then all of the energy that comes from these nutrients is used to fuel anabolic reactions within the animal body. And we have different metabolic rates that we see. So a basal metabolic rate is for our endotherms. Our ectotherms, our cold-blooded animals, actually have something called a standard metabolic rate. But since we're mostly focused on human biology, we are going to be talking about basal metabolic rate here, which is often abbreviated BMR. And that's the average amount of energy used by an organism in a non-active state. So you'll hear like that we normally talk about this is part of a 2,000 a day or 2,000 calories a day diet. That is considered by a lot of people to be kind of a standard BMR for humans. It's really probably a little bit higher than what the average is for most humans. And your BMR really depends on quite a few things, right? It depends on how active you are throughout the day. Or sorry, that's your BMR doesn't depend on how active you are throughout the day, but it does change if you are more active. Your basal metabolic rate won't change, but you can add more calories, right? So if you're working out a lot, you're burning calories, and so your BMR might be, let's say, 1,600 calories. So you can eat 1,600 calories without gaining or losing weight. And if you go over that, you're going to be gaining weight. If you go under that, you're going to be losing weight. That's kind of the theory, right? But if you work out, you are burning more calories. So you might instead have a metabolic rate of 1,800 calories. So you could eat 1,800 calories without gaining or losing weight. And if you're under or over that, that would be determining how much you lose or gain on your journey. Keep in mind, excess energy is given off as heat. There's no real way to preserve that energy. And if you have taken chemistry or physics and you've learned about entropy and that all things exist. So whether they change states or not doesn't mean that they weren't there. We still have that energy, but it's just given off as heat. So we lose that energy right away to heat, like say if we're sweating or something like that. In your class activity or your assignment this week, you are calculating out what your BMR is based on your height and weight. Again, I've said it in the assignment, but please, if you are uncomfortable with that or if you're triggered by that, please just use a made up height and weight, but you do need to show your work. And I encourage you to do it for your height and weight, whether or not you show me that side is fine. I'm looking to see that you can do these calculations and you understand the basic concepts behind it. Okay, so you'll calculate out your BMR, and then we're going to go further into bioenergetics and talking about different endotherms. We've kind of thrown out ectotherms at this point because we are so focused on humans, but we can see we're comparing here a mouse versus an elephant. One is obviously much smaller. The mouse is 35 grams versus the elephant at 4.5 million grams. But what's actually interesting here is it might be something a little bit different than what you'd expect is our mouse actually has a higher metabolic rate than the elephant. And this is because this little guy here loses heat a lot faster because it has a larger surface area than the elephant does in comparison to its mass. So these guys are also like considered a little bit more active, right? A lot of smaller animals are more active. They have to expend more energy to do the things that larger animals can do in, say, fewer steps or whatever it might be. So smaller endothermic organisms actually have a higher BMR than the larger ones because they're losing that energy or that heat so much faster. In addition, if you are more active, then you're going to have a higher BMR than inactive ones. Just like when I talked about if you're working out versus not working out, then your BMR will increase as you are expending more energy. You're able to take in more energy through nutrients. A very brief introduction to bioenergetics, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we start getting into nutrition and things later in the semester. But moving on, talking more about animal body planes and cavities. So we kind of mentioned this earlier, and I'm just going to go ahead and skip this slide and go right to the photo so that you can kind of see. But these are our endotherm or eumetozoa animals, right? So we can think of a four-legged animal versus a bipedal human, let's say. But they do have the same planes. They might just be a little bit different depending on how you think about it. So midline is literally so that it's our bilateral symmetry line, right? So we're cutting us right down the middle so that we have the left side and the right side of the animal. And you can see this in a four-legged versus a human, same thing. Transverse plane will change a little bit depending on if it's a four-legged or two-legged animal, but transverse plane through us would cut through like our stomach horizontally, right? And we would make cuts this way. So we use these different planes to describe how we're looking at an animal, or you might see a slide that says transverse section of a goat brain, right? Which means that if I were looking at it, I would be looking this way at the goat brain. Sorry, I realize I don't have this on this way at the goat brain. The transverse plane is here. Whereas if I were looking at a transverse plane of the human brain, it would be like a horizontal cut of it. Okay, so you kind of have to know how these planes work in different types of body plans and what you're expecting, and it's mostly in reference to looking at different organs, organ systems, tissues, things like that. We're looking at different planes of the animal. Frontal plane here, again, a little bit different than the four-legged here, but that's what we see is sagittal, frontal, and then transverse. Okay, now we're going to get into what kind of tissues that we see in animals, and there's four main types. So we have epithelia, connective, muscles, and neurons. If you've heard of epithelia or epithelium, these are the cells that are lining different cavities, open spaces, and surfaces like our skin. Connective tissues, these are pretty appropriately named, right? They're connecting tissues together, providing additional support. Our muscles are generating movement, and our neurons are generating and sending electrical signals within the central nervous system. Okay, getting into talking about different kinds of cells, I'm going to let you read a little bit about this in your text as well to understand where you would see these kinds of cells. But we have two different types within each, or yeah, I guess two different types within each one of these different types of cells. We have simple versus stratified. Simple meaning one layer, stratified meaning multiple layers. So we have simple squamous cells, stratified squamous cells. We have simple cuboidal cells. So you can see these are kind of cube shaped. Simple columnar. These are kind of like our tall, long cells here. And then we have something called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial. So these guys are pseudostratified instead of stratified because they're not actually multiple layers, but they're arranged differently so that they look like they're multiple layers. But it is actually not necessarily multiple layers. I know it can be a little bit confusing, and you'll see this in our columnar epithelial cells. So with our columnar cells, the long, tall ones, you'll see this pseudostratified from time to time. And then our connective tissue. So this has something called fibroblast cells within it, and it's embedded in what's called a non-cellular matrix. The matrix is usually composed of something called a ground substance, and that's a combination of collagen, elastic, or reticular fibers. Connective tissues are used to connect different tissues or give the body structure. Blood is also considered a connective tissue, which is interesting. It's maybe not what we would expect from a connective tissue, but it is considered a connective tissue. We have erythrocytes, leukocytes, we have plasma. Our erythrocytes are the most common. Those are our red blood cells, right? And they're essentially delivering oxygen to the body. And then these guys are suspended within an intercellular matrix, which is our plasma. Okay, so that's kind of what we think of for the ground substance. You can see here different types of connective tissue. Again, we've got blood down here, and we've got our red blood cells, our white blood cells, our erythrocytes, and our leukocytes. Leukocytes being more responsible for immune functions. And then we have loose or areolar connective tissue. These have fibroblasts, macrophages, some lymphocytes, some neutrophils. And they've got a few different fibers: collagen, elastic, reticular, and these you can find around blood vessels. They're also anchoring epithelia, or that surface level of cells. We also have dense fibrous connective tissue. These are our fibroblasts and macrophages. These are mostly collagen. I should mention too, macrophages are also responsible for immune system functions. Essentially, they're kind of a white blood cell, and they kind of kill other microorganisms, remove dead cells. They stimulate other actions of the immune system as well. And then fibroblasts are just other cells that are basically contributing to the formation of connective tissue. So they're just adding collagen proteins or whatever it might be to help create this connective tissue. Cartilage, chondrocytes, chondroblasts. We have some cartilage, like in our nose, let's say. Often places we also often think of it in the shark skeleton. We also have it in our ears. Bone. These are our osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts. The prefix osteo is associated with bone. So anytime you see osteo, you can kind of assume it's bone associated. We've got some collagen elastic here, and that's what our vertebrate skeletons are made out of. And adipose is fat, basically. The cells within it are adipocytes, and the place that you find it is within the fat. There are different fat stores for different kinds of animals, depending on what kind of animal it is. If they're hibernating, if they go into torpor during like summer months, really depends on how those animals are functioning. So some examples that you'll see here, we can see our blood cells, and then we can see a few other samples here. Here's our fibroblasts that we can see with the nucleus in there. We see these collagen fibers. So you'll get a pretty good idea reading through the text as well of different kinds of connective tissues that we see. For muscle tissues, we've only got 3 kinds, so it's pretty easy to remember. And basically it breaks down into smooth or skeletal, and then cardiac, our heart muscle, that has its own type of muscle. So we refer to our muscles as either smooth or striated, right? So smooth here, that means that we don't have any bands within it, or it's not striated. And skeletal muscle is striated, so you'll see bands or stripes within it. Cardiac muscle is also striated, but it's a little bit different. You'll see here, skeletal muscle has many nuclei along the periphery of the muscle, and it has voluntary control. So our skeletal muscles are, like our biceps and our quads, things that we are voluntarily moving in most cases, right? If you're lifting weights, if you're playing basketball, if you're walking, those are voluntary movements. And those are all of our skeletal muscles. Whereas our cardiac muscle is still striated. It is a striated muscle, but it only has one nuclei right in the center of it, and its control is involuntary, right? We don't control our heartbeat. We can do things to speed it up or slow it down, but it's still involuntarily contracting and pushing blood through. That's something that our autonomic nervous system automatically takes care of for us. And then smooth muscle here, no striations. It does have a singular nuclei right in the center. This is also involuntary. So this is all of our visceral organs. So, your digestive system, your liver, all of these things that are working within your body without you having to control them. And again, like the heart, we can do things that, upset them or make them run smoother, but overall we have no real control over it. So you'll see here kind of the summary of skeletal versus smooth, and then cardiac, which is essentially like a skeletal muscle type, but only found in the heart. So it's a little bit different. We also have these things called intercalated discs within the heart. And these are basically just connecting other cardiac cells. So they're kind of like what gap junctions are. They're linking the cells together, and they define the borders, and that's how those cells communicate with each other. So here's some examples here. Our skeletal muscle cells, our cardiac muscle cells, these are our striated cells here. And then we'll see these intercalated discs along with our central singular nuclei. And then you'll see here the nuclei, there's lots of them, and they're on the periphery. So there's the difference there. And then smooth muscle cells are not striated, and they've just got that one nucleus in the center of it. Okay, getting into nervous tissue. And sorry, I should preface, all of these cells that we're talking about right now, we're going to see more in-depth examples as we get into different organ systems throughout the semester. So as we get into digestive system, or let's say the nervous system. So you're going to be seeing these again. This is kind of a quick introduction to what they are and what purposes they serve. So our nervous tissue, this is found within our central nervous system, and even our peripheral nervous system in some cases. But our nervous tissue, this consists of neurons and something called neuroglia. So you can see here, this is a neuron. It's got several different parts to it. But the main thing that we want you to know about neurons at this point is that they generate and transmit electrical impulses. So we can see here dendrites, these tree-like things. This is what's connecting to other neurons. We have the cell body here. We have an axon. This is what's sending the signal up and down it, with oligodendrocytes attached. And if there's glia or neuroglia on it, that means it's myelinated, and it means that that signal will be sent usually much faster. Again, we'll get into more details on all of that later, but just know that nervous tissue has neurons and neuroglia for now. Getting into homeostasis and thermoregulation, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about homeostasis before, but basically our bodies have all organisms really, but we're talking more specifically about humans. We have certain internal conditions that have a set point, right? Our pH, our temperature, things like that, that we really can't operate out of a really far range. For instance, our regular temperature is usually around 98 degrees, 98.6. If it goes up a little bit to 99, maybe 100, we've got a really low grade fever. It's not too big of an issue. We can still operate there. But once you get to, say, 103, 104, that's where you're being hospitalized, right? And I think is it 107 or 109? Sorry, I'm pretty sure it's 107. If we hit something like 107 or even as low as like 96 degrees, that's where we have permanent brain damage or even brain death. So our body really can't go even 10 degrees on either direction, hotter or colder, right? We've got a set point, and we really want to be right around it for our body to be happy and not be having lots of issues. Same thing with pH, right? So if conditions stray too far from that set point, then we have homeostatic mechanisms that kick in. And that set point can change potentially over time. You can alter it, but homeostasis will always work towards a set point still. So it might change over time, and then it'll work towards that new set point, But as it changes, depending on if you have a real new set point or if you're just moving away from it, it might still go back to kind of the same thing. So setting a new set point would be basically acclimatizing, and this is when you change or you have changes in one organ system to maintain a set point in another organ system. So a good example of this is when you're living or working at high altitudes. Say you want to go climb Mount Everest. Can you go from where we live in Hawaii to the top of Mount Everest right away? No, you can't. You'll get really sick. You'll get something called altitude sickness, in fact. And some of you might even get altitude sickness going from here to, let's say, 10,000 feet. Some of you might even get it less than that. I know people that get altitude sickness when they go over to Mauna Kea on Big Island. So it's possible at even a less of an altitude than, say, Everest. But what you do is you start acclimatizing. So you start at sea level and then you climb a little bit and you stay at that altitude for, a handful of days or weeks, depending on your body and where you're going. And then you keep climbing until your body starts being acclimatized to that new altitude. You're building up more red blood cells, adding in more oxygen to your system so that you can set your body to operate up here instead of down here, and you've got enough oxygen to maintain that. That's just one example of acclimatization. There are other examples as well, but that's one that you'll hear pretty often is working with altitude. And you'll see that people are already well groomed for this, right? So if you look at people that live in Hawaii versus people that live in Nepal, up in the mountains in the Himalayas, are Sherpas, right? Not our Sherpas, but they're Sherpas. They have much higher red blood cell counts and are already acclimatized to living in those conditions. And so some of those guys can essentially run up Mount Everest, and we're like dying at base camp. So that's climatization in a nutshell. Most homeostasis and thermoregulation has what's called a negative feedback loop. So this is something that's counteracting any internal changes. It's reversing the direction of that change. And in all cases, this is really a good thing, right? So say you eat something and your blood glucose level is going to rise. We don't want our blood glucose level to stay higher than it should be. So our pancreas then will release some insulin. In response to the insulin, our target cells will take up that glucose, and our liver is going to convert it into what's called glycogen. So that's kind of like stored energy for us. And our blood glucose level is going to fall back down to where it should be. Our pancreas is going to release glucagon. And in response to glycogen, right, that we converted down here, the liver is going to break down glycogen and release glucose into the blood. And we go through this whole feedback loop of rising and lowering our blood glucose levels as we eat and as our body works against it so that we maintain our set point. Same thing happens with temperature, pH, blood calcium, temperature, right? If you're getting too hot or too cold, your body's going to do things to counteract that as much as it can. If you're getting too hot, you're going to start sweating, right? And we see this in other animals as well, but this is what's referred to as a negative feedback loop. There are also positive feedback loops, but they're not quite as common to see. When we're thinking about positive feedback loops, these are the ones that maintain and potentially strengthen the response to a stimulus. Good example of this is oxytocin and birth. So as your baby is pushing against the cervix, causing it to stretch, that stretching causes nerve impulses to be sent to the brain, which stimulates the pituitary to release oxytocin, and that causes the uterus to contract. So as you're going through labor, if you're lucky enough to go through labor as a female, you're going to release more and more oxytocin and continue this positive feedback loop of contractions until that baby is born. There's not many biological systems that we see on a positive feedback loop, but this does exist, and it's usually, for things like this that we want to keep pushing until whatever it is done, like birth of a human infant. Again, we've got to maintain a relatively constant internal temperature to keep our enzymes efficient and avoid denaturation. We talked a little bit about enzymes already, that they kind of have to be in their happy place, right? They've got to have the right enzymes working for the right things. And we want to avoid denaturation, which is where our proteins are essentially falling apart, usually when it gets like too hot. So our hypothalamus is what is responsible for thermoregulatory control. And we see that it does differ between endotherms and ectotherms, because our endotherms are warm-blooded versus our ectotherms, cold-blooded, that are more affected by the environment that they're in. So we can maintain our temperature in a few different ways: by radiation, convection, conduction, or evaporation. So radiation is basically transferring heat via infrared waves, and this occurs between any two objects when their temperatures are different. So you can see like the sun here radiating heat, right? So that will warm our skin, which will then warm our body. That would work for both an endotherm and an ectotherm. We also have what's called convection. And convection is the transfer of heat to the air surrounding the skin. So warmed air is going to rise away from the body and be replaced by cooler air that is subsequently heated. This happens a lot in water as well. When the water temperature is lower than your body's temperature, the body will lose heat by warming the water closest to the skin, which moves away to be replaced by cooler water. So this kind of creates currents created by temperature changes. And this is about how we lose, we lose about 15% of the body's heat through convection. Conduction here. Conduction is kind of the opposite. So it's a transfer of heat by two objects that are in direct contact with one another. So if your skin comes in contact with a cold or warm object, like if you're holding a warm mug that you see here, that's one way that you can kind of heat yourself up. We only lose about 3% of our body heat through conduction. And then we have evaporation. Evaporation, right, is a transfer of heat by the evaporation of water. It does take a lot of energy to do this, right? To change a water molecule to a liquid, from a liquid to a gas, which is evaporating water, that takes a lot of energy. So evaporating water in the form of sweat, in our case, it can take a lot of energy from the skin. But the rate of evaporation occurs depends on your humidity as well. So the more sweat evaporates in lower humidity environments, like you'd be in a dry desert, versus if you're in Hawaii where we have pretty high humidity. And that's a pretty, sweating is kind of a primary means of cooling the body during exercise that we talked about before, this evaporation. And at rest, only about 20% of heat is lost by the body through evaporation. So those are kind of our 4 different ways that we can maintain temperature as part of our homeostasis, and again, part of a set point, right? As humans, we want to be at around 98.6 degrees. So think about these negative feedback loops that you see and the very few positive feedback loops that you see in the body as well. Again, much fewer examples of that. But read through your book on this chapter and kind of understand some of the details within it. Again, this is kind of an introduction to all of these topics, as we'll be getting deeper into a lot of them as we go further in this semester.